Once upon a time, there was a girl named Little Red Riding Hood. She lived in the forest with her mother in a small cottage. One day, her mother told Little Red to bring a basket of yarn to her sick grandmother because she loved to knit and lived on the other side of the forest. Her mother told her, "Red, bring this basket of yarn to your poor grandmother." Angrily, Red replied, "No, I don't want to." "Don't be a rebel," her mother reviled. "I raised you better than to be an indolent girl. You're completely robust enough to walk over to your grandmother's house. You know very well of her many illnesses. Her alexia, her hypertension, her hyperactive blood pressure, her hypoglycemia. She's also in a very rheumatic state right now, meaning she's now sedentary, so you must take this to her immediately." "Fine," replied Red, and took the basket of yarn and started marching towards the door. "Be warned," admonished her mother. "Do not be diffident and go straight to your grandmother's house. There have been an increased incidence of attacks in the forest. Do not speak to any strangers, and if you do, be very reticent." "I understand," said Red, and she headed off to her grandmother's house. While she was walking, she ran into the big bad bunny. When he asked where she was going, she tried her best to ignore her. "Well, my mother gave me a providence to very taciturn if I run into anyone," she explained. "She's very stringent, and I wouldn't want to break her rules. Plus, everyone calls you the big bad bunny. You're that carnivore who's been eating all those people." "Don't be afraid," he explained. "I know I cause a lot of controversy, but that's because our government is such an autocracy. They don't know what they're talking about. Everyone only thinks of themselves and err in the way of they think of me. Look at me. Do I look innocuous?" "No," replied Red. "In fact, you seem like a very convivial person." She then told the bunny that she was only going to her old, senile grandmother's house to drop off the basket of yarn, not knowing his true intentions. He bid her goodbye and ran off ahead of her. Red finally arrived at her grandma's house, and she was ecstatic to see her. But the closer she got, the more she realized that her grandma looked a bit different. "What big ears you have," she observed. "The better to satiate them with your wonderful voice," she replied. "What big hands you have," she observed again. "The better to feel you with," the grandma replied. "What big teeth you have," Red observed again. "The better to eat you with," the bunny replied. Red realized who the grandma really was and ran for her life. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there was a lowly miller, diffidently going about his milling life. Since he was a misosophist, he refused to better himself through the means of education. As he became more and more nihilistic from the derision he was receiving from others higher than him, he decided to contradict his embarrassing state. He culpably proclaimed that his daughter had the ability to spin straw into gold.
My daughter can spin straw into gold.
Word had got around, and it wasn't long until the king heard this story, and the story propitiated him. At first, he almost derided at the miller at the thought of his accusation, but something in the back of his mind told him that the miller could be telling the truth. Whether it was by result of his greed or his being a xenophile towards lower class women, the king had called the daughter all the way from his mirador to come to his castle despite the lack of veracity in the miller's story. Unlike her father, the daughter was smart, and knew that this invitation meant a tacit arrest, since it was a known verity in the kingdom that an arrest always meant death, for that was the only way for the king to exculpate his criminals. But the daughter knew she had no choice. As the daughter stepped into the opulent castle, the affluent king quickly greeted her and cursorily described what he wanted of her. He simply wanted her to be a coadjutant of him in his quest to become even wealthier than he already was. He told her to spin his straw into gold, like her father said she could. He also constricted her time and told her to do it in 3 days or he would kill her. The king then dragged the girl into his basement where his dungeon was and threw her into a room filled with straw. He then told her to get to work. The daughter was hysterical. Her piety seemed to grow as she prayed for hours, asking God to exonerate her father and forgive him for his infidelity, as she would make it her onus to make her father believe in him. After all, it's hard to stay calm when asked to do something that's not cognizable by any human being. Her hysteria led to mimosas, as she started to feel physically sick. Lucky for her, a troll appeared, and he seemed very sagacious regarding her situation, and seemed venal in helping her. Despite the troll's idiolect consisting of mumbles and unfamiliar words, the daughter was able to understand his colloquialism, and knew that he knew how to spin straw into gold. The daughter was overwhelmed with joy, and she knew she didn't have to die that night, but in return he asked for her ring, and she was more than happy to give it to him. When the king saw the room full of gold, he was filled with overwhelming happiness.
Oh my god!
Now knowing that the miller was telling the truth and that his daughter had an amazing ability to spin straw into gold, he quickly shoved her out of the old room and took her into a new, bigger room filled with even more straw. He then explained how she wanted her to do it again for him and giving her only 2 days this time, or else he would still kill her. Once again the troll appeared and he offered her the same deal. This time, the troll wanted her necklace in return for his deeds. The troll worked his magic one more time and then fled the scene. The king was so impressed that he took her into another room. He gave her more straw and told her that this time she only had 1 day. The troll appeared and offered to spin her straw into gold again. When the daughter told him that she had nothing else to give him, he insisted on taking her firstborn child. The king was so happy that he was quick to marry her. Together the two of them had a baby, and the miller's daughter completely forgot about the deal she made with the troll. The troll heard about the baby and quickly came to claim his reward. The daughter, reluctant to give up her firstborn child, hypocritically refused to give the troll her baby. The troll gave the daughter 3 days to guess his name since he felt bad for her. He said that if she didn't guess his name correctly, he would come back and take the baby.
George! Day 2. Bertha!
Desperate to keep her baby, the daughter followed the troll out of the castle and found him frolicking and chanting his soliloquy in a field. Luckily, he was chanting his name over and over again. My name is Rumpelstiltskin.
Rumpelstiltskin!
Once upon a time, there lived a beautiful princess named Snow White. She was full of vivacity and had a wonderful palace all to herself. She was also quite derisive because she had such visibility. One day, her father died for unknown reasons, and her recent stepmom became queen. She was a belligerent queen who held an autocracy over the kingdom. She practiced witchcraft and hated Snow White. Every day, she would ask her magic mirror, who served as her own placebo, who the fairest one of the land was. And every day it said the same thing: Snow White. And she wasn't too happy about that. She eventually got so angry that she tried to kill Snow, but luckily, Snow escaped. She ran as fast as she could and ran deep, deep into the forest. She came across a cottage with a beautiful panorama. Cold, hungry, tired, and curious, she stepped inside. It was dirty and empty inside, and being the nice person she was, she decided to clean it up for whoever lived there. Because she was Philharmonic, she sang as she cleaned.
My heart is sad and lonely, for you I sighed, for you dear only.
Soon the owners of the cottage appeared, the dwarves.
You are the promised kiss of springtime, that makes the love.
Each dwarf had a distinct personality. There was Doc, a natural leader. There was Sleepy, who was always sleeping. There was Vigil, who was the opposite of sleepy. And Placid, who was always bored. The dwarves were first very coalesced and holistic, and they didn't want anyone else living in their home. But then the dwarves convened, and Doc, the color, presided in the meeting. They revised their rash thinking and tried to look at the situation in a macroscopic way. They realized how good that Snow was at cleaning their cottage and how versatile she was, and decided to let her stay. The dwarves were mirific people and worked in the local mines all day. One day, while the dwarves were at work, Snow was singing in a field, minding her own business. Prince Charming just happened to be walking by, and when he heard her beautiful singing, he immediately fell in love with her. He explained to her how he heard her euphonious singing, and that just her singing itself could fulfill all of his carnalities, but Snow was too afraid of him and ran away. Thinking that Snow died in the forest, the queen once again asked her mirror who the fairest one of them all was. Still, it said Snow White. Angry, the queen disguised herself as an old woman, cooked up a poisonous pineapple, and set off to kill Snow. She came across the cottage that Snow was staying at and knocked at the door. When Snow answered, all she saw was a lonely old woman and opened the door for her. The queen gave Snow the pineapple, and thinking it was a gift, Snow quickly bit into it. Because it was a noxious contraband, Snow's blood pressure immediately went hypobaric, and she fell into a necromasis. The dwarves saw her cadaver on the floor, and despite her aberrance, were able to diagnose her illness as a curse. The animals of the forest immediately rushed to find the prince because they were cognizant and knew that True Love's kiss would break the curse. It was Pansy that True Love's kiss was a panacea. They told the prince about Snow's pandemic, and he rushed to her side. The advent of the prince served as a holophone to the dwarves. He saw Snow dead on the table and became tremulous at the thought of her death. He leaned in, the kiss revitalized the reincarnated Snow, and she woke up and lived happily ever after with her prince. Once upon a time, brother and sister Hansel and Gretel lived in a small cottage with their father and stepmother. They were a very poor family, but their father loved them very much. One day, their evil and indecorous stepmother, who loved to vilify and control their father, one day averred him that the task of feeding Hansel and Gretel was just too onerous. She ordered him to leave them in the forest, or, in a more euphemistic way, to let them go. The kids knew that the fact that their mother was stricturing their food was a presage. Their father felt horrible about it, but he knew he had to do it. The kids felt horribly betrayed. They confided all their trust in their father, and he just abandoned them. Hansel was very smart and sophisticated, though, and before they left, he took some bread so that he could make a breadcrumb trail as they walked, and they could find their way back home. But, as they were walking, they turned around and realized that behind them, the birds were eating their trail. Eventually, they came across a beautiful cottage surrounded by deciduous trees. The macrocosm of the cottage was entirely made of candy. It was such an aberration from all the other cottages they'd seen, and curiosity took the better of them. The old woman who lived there eloquently invited them inside for dinner. Gretel had a sudden premonition that something bad was going to happen, and a wild feeling of trepidation swept over her body. But it was too late. The witch grabbed Hansel and threw him into a room and locked him in. She also made Gretel her slave. The witch planned on eating Hansel and fed only him food to fatten him up. Hansel and Gretel were co-educated, with very wide lexicons, and even though Gretel was a precursor to Hansel, he was just as smart, if not smarter. Knowing that the witch was blind, Hansel took an old key, and whenever she came to feel how fat his fingers were getting, he would hold it out for her to feel. The witch grew tired of waiting and decided to eat him anyway. Also, she realized that she was hungry enough to eat Gretel too. The witch asked Gretel to turn on the oven for her, but Gretel knew that she was about to eat her and her brother and pretended not to know how. She asked the witch to show her, and when the witch got into a close enough proximity of the oven, she pushed her inside. Her propitious act allowed her and her brother to escape, and when they did, the witch's house collapsed. Buried under her house was tons and tons of treasure. They found their way home, and their father, who had been in a duller state, explained to them that their stepmother had just died and that he would never ever leave them ever again. They fed off of the witch's gold and lived happily ever after.